I am Emma Linsell. I am the Executive Director for Strategy, Performance and Engagement at UKRI, UK Research and Innovation. I have the enormous privilege of job sharing that role with Isabel Stephen. And just a little bit of background on me. I have come to UKRI about 3.5 years ago into this role after a career that started for the first 15 years in Treasury. And then more recently, I was Business Strategy Director in DWP, Housing Director at what's now DLUC, and also a few years working with the New Zealand government. So I think in common with quite a few of you, my background is policy making, but I have hugely relished the opportunity to step into this role on strategy around research and innovation. But just a couple of reflections before I set up the rest of today. So I think even on that career, it took me a while, I have to admit, to realise for myself as a policy maker then the immense value of listening, of actually some humility in that policy development process. And I think really that is why I'm so delighted to be able to chair today's event for all of you who probably worked out much sooner than I had about that value of humility and listening. And therefore, I am really looking forward to the opportunity to explore together the incredible value, and in fact, I'll probably say imperative, of really trying to understand citizens' perspectives and then explore together the different ways that you can lean on professional experts to help us all draw that in through dialogue into that policy cycle, right from framing the questions that we should be asking through to iterating and implementing the options. So let me just move on a little bit more to what you can expect from today. Very sadly, one of our speakers has lost her voice. It was a big challenge when you're trying to do it on this. So we won't have Dr. Anna Mixis with us to talk about biomass, which is a real shame because that was a great dialogue. But we do have 3 fabulous other speakers, and it will give us more time for Q&A. So as I said earlier, I'm going to keep encouraging you to make sure you're using that Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Right, before we come back to the rest of that programme, let me now hand over to Susanna Lansdell from Sciencewise, who's going to shine a bit more of a light on their excellent programme and system. So over to you, Susanna.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for that. Can I have the next slide, please, Adam? So I wanted to just take a few moments to briefly introduce Sciencewise and public dialogue. Today is very much about the speakers that we're going to hear from. So those of you who are interested in Sciencewise, there will be my contact details and an evaluation form afterwards where you can note if you want us to get in touch with you. Sciencewise is a UKRI funded programme, and it's there to provide evidence on public aspirations, concerns, views and values around new and emerging areas of science, tech and innovation. And of course, along with the views on the potential benefits and disadvantages of those science, tech and innovations. And doing that to enable socially informed research and policy making. We do that sort of two key ways: by supporting the commissioning of deliberative public dialogue, but also by sharing the learning of those dialogues as well and how to do it. In terms of support, we provide expert advice, assurance and co-funding to commissioners of public dialogue. And that co-funding, depending on the dialogue need, can be up to 50% of the cost of the dialogue. And we sit alongside and work with commissioners right from the concept of the public dialogue all the way through to completion. So supporting that to happen and looking to build quality and share learning. How we share evidence and learning is events like today, but also last month we held a lunch and learn session on the impacts of public dialogue. But also, and I'd encourage you all to go here, we've got a website which is a really, really rich resource of evidence, learning and insight from the nearly 70 public dialogues that Sciencewise has supported over the years. And of course, all of those insights are derived from thousands of public participants and hundreds of specialists over the years. So whether it be from food to flight, from net zero to nanotech or data and drones and more, really the Sciencewise website has loads of information about dialogue that has been held in those areas. Next slide, please, Adam. So what is public dialogue? Our Sciencewise guiding principles talk about it as a process during which members of the public interact with scientists, specialists, stakeholders and policymakers to deliberate on issues relevant to future policy decisions. But a few features that I really wanted to pick out that makes Sciencewise supported dialogue special. They are structured, facilitated conversations with publics and specialists on social and ethical implications of new and emerging science and tech. All of the dialogues that we support have to have that potential route to impact, to inform something, whether that be a policy or a strategy. So we establish that early on. The participants that take part in the dialogues are recruited specifically, paid for their time and reflective of the UK population. They are inclusive of the range of demographics across the UK, sometimes involving specialist publics as well, and always in multiple sessions over many hours, face-to-face, online, or a mix of both. There's always independent oversight, drawing on wider perspectives around the issue to provide assurance around the quality of the process and the quality of the content, as well as independent formative and summative evaluation that is commissioned alongside the dialogue. And that really helps inform throughout and draw out the learnings and the impact that the dialogue has had. Next slide, please. So if this sounds interesting, if you're thinking about how public voice could really add value or robustness to your policy or research area, maybe to shape priorities or to test assumptions, test directions, shape programs or strategies, then please do get in touch. As I say, today is much more about the speakers and hearing from their experiences, but do get in touch with me on that email address. And I'm really pleased today that we get to hear directly from those commissioners of Sciencewise supported dialogues over the last 18 months or so. Thanks a lot. Back to you, Emma.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susanna. Oh, I don't know if I was unmuted just then. Thank you very much, Susanna. Right. So before I take us through to the speakers, let me just also zoom back out and just make sure that you've understood. You'll see my name, Emma Linsell, UKRI. Some of you might not be that familiar with UKRI, so let me just explain how this work nests within the whole of what UKRI seeks to achieve. So we think you'll understand this language. We are an arm's length body for the newly created DCIT department. We invest over 8 billion, a huge amount. We're the largest public funder of research and innovation in the UK. And we do so through a really wide-ranging portfolio, from sort of specific sort of grants to projects and fellowships and that territory, through to long-term technology infrastructures, through to sort of large-scale funding into universities or institutes themselves. And it's great to be able to talk to you today, because just yesterday in Parliament, we celebrated both our 5-year birthday, but also the first year of our long-term strategy. And in that strategy, we were able to explain how we want to work right across that research and innovation system to enable the UK to stay at the global forefront of R&I, and to do that through the way that we in UKRI invest, but also connect and convene that R&I system. So in that strategy, we're able to set out how we want to work together in a shared endeavour across policymakers, academia, businesses, right through all parts of that system, charities, as well as all the many talented individuals we work with, to build a better connected, a much more diverse and more resilient R&I system. And one, and this is why it's particularly important for today, and one that puts deeper engagement right at the heart of all we do together, which takes me through to today, of which this is such a key plank of that. So I think today's webinar, as Susanna was explaining, is here to give us all a better insight into how public dialogue, as supported by Sciencewise, can help you understand what the public think at different stages of the research and policy cycle. So to really remember how important that public perspective is in that cycle, from right upstream, that framing of what the questions are we should be asking ourselves, through to trying to expose what some of the issues and complexities are, through to those different options that you wrestle and iterate, right through to how to implement well. And public dialogue is important at all parts of that. Quite often people I know make the mistake of thinking it's at the final stage of implementation, but it really isn't. It speaks to all aspects of that public policy. And it then helps us make sure that that research and that policy is much more robust and much more reflective of public's hopes, their fears, their aspirations, and the complexity of the worlds in which they feel they inhabit. So, as I said, we're going to be joined by 3 speakers from commission bodies who, with Sciencewise support, have engaged with the public at different stages in the decision-making process. So I wonder if I could invite Nina to introduce herself now and take us through some of her experience.
Thank you. Yes, I think the slides are going to pop up, but firstly to introduce myself, I'm Nina Grassman. I'm a senior behavioural and social scientist at the Government Office for Science. We are an independent body and technically part of that newly formed department DSIT, but led by the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, who is independent. Our main purpose, I suppose, is we advise usually the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet, but also customers all across government, to ensure that government policies and decisions are informed by the best scientific evidence, and especially for this strategic long-term thinking, which is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a specific foresight project where we commissioned public dialogue as part of it, looking at 4 potential scenarios where net zero has been met in 2050. Just move on to the first slide. Yes, so in this project, the main kind of the crux of what we did was using a range of futures and foresight methods to picture 4 scenarios of society where net zero has been reached. So kind of imagine we're in 2050. These are 4 potential, deliberately kind of provocative and stretching scenarios to see what net zero society might look like. And the themes that we built these around were the built environment, travel and transport, work and industry, and food and land use. Like it says there, we knew that a project that has society in the name, it needed to have public dialogue as part of it, which is why this work was then kicked off. And in this project specifically, public dialogue was used to, 1, explore attitudes and perspectives on potential net zero scenarios, but secondly, that I think is something that hasn't been done too much in the past, although I'm quite new to futures and foresight thinking. I come from a kind of psychological behavioral science background, is to explore how public dialogue can contribute to foresight work. So what are the challenges, what are the opportunities of putting public dialogue 27 years in the future to understand how people think about the future in that way, and also how it can help Go Science in general as we explore how to engage with the public more. So what we learned, I think the biggest thing, we're discussing this as a team because it's been a few months since the public dialogue wrapped up, is really the difference between what we hear every day in Whitehall about what policymakers think about what people think, and then what the public actually think when it comes to reaching net zero. They are very different. Participants in our dialogue were extremely aware of climate issues, the need for quite transformative societal change to reach net zero, and then the trade-offs that policymakers will need to consider as we kind of move into the final 25 years until 2050. The dialogue gave Go Science, and hopefully through us, the government, a more nuanced view of public opinion on net zero, including which aspects of future scenarios were least plausible, were most plausible, which worked for who in different parts of the UK, different ages, different backgrounds, and then which pathways to net zero that we've kind of mapped out the public might find most challenging. In terms of the impact of using dialogue, we're running, well, I say there is an evaluation being run on how that worked for foresight, which I'm really looking forward to seeing the results on, so hopefully we could kind of use it more. But we were able to create a really rich picture of the scenarios, and so through the work with the commission, so who we commissioned, Ipsos, was to be able to create both visual and textual, and kind of through the use of materials and kind of images like that, to try and transport the participants into 2050 to understand what they thought, which was challenging, And it had lots of interesting conversations to find that kind of balance between putting people in 2050 but not making it seem too far away. So what we did, we used quantitative and qualitative insights. This is for the wider report, which is how the dialogue then fed into the qualitative aspects, is initial desk-based research to understand what those key societal trends were going to be and what the drivers of social change might be. We had a series of expert workshops to develop 4 future scenario narratives, so what society in the broader sense was like for people. We quantified these qualitative narratives by running energy systems models to understand what the actual energy systems that might be required are. So that was more on the quantitative side. Then on the qualitative side, we had this public dialogue to understand more about what the public might expect for the future of the UK society. Top tips and thinking about the wider implications of our public dialogue. It was extremely useful for the Net Zero Society project, but also for wider awareness raising of public dialogue in cross-government foresight groups. So as I mentioned, public dialogue hasn't been used too extensively in futures and foresight methods, and in itself, futures and foresight is still quite a new way of thinking in government. But to be able to introduce from Go Science that kind of next step of thinking about engaging the public in the future, I think is going to have wide-ranging impacts. And we've already engaged with multiple teams across government who are very interested in using these methods in the future, and hopefully we can kind of lead the way on that. For example, there's a Heads of Horizon Scanning network where we could upskill members about how to use public dialogue in this way. And then through that, obviously, be creating more test cases and increasing the visibility and use of public engagement in cross-government futures work. That's me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nina. That was brilliant. And I'm really pleased that you're optimistic about the future. About futures and about, therefore, the opportunity to continue to use this more. So let's explore that later. Just to confirm to everyone, the chat is now closed. We have the Q&A function, though, very live. So I'm hoping to see the number of Qs coming in there, just mounting up, some of which we might be able to just answer there and then because they're factual. But actually, if they're about to bring them into the conversation later, we'll gather those up and we'll make sure we're sparking back on that. Right, I think I'd now like to bring in George to give us his overview and his experience. So welcome to this webinar.
Thank you, Emma. And hi, everyone. I should start by thanking Sciencewise for inviting me to speak and also for supporting this work. And thanks to everyone attending today for your interest in our presentation. So I am George Onisiforu. I work at the NHS AI Lab. We are a central team within the NHS, and we are tasked with accelerating the safe adoption of artificial intelligence technologies in health and care settings. My work involves addressing the ethical considerations when developing and adopting these technologies. And a lot of it is about establishing trust and confidence in AI. So the project that I will talk about today is part of our exploration to develop more trusted processes when accessing health data for AI purposes. So it is about who gets to decide on this. If I can get the next slide, please. So why we considered the dialogue. So the nature of artificial intelligence and the challenges we have to address are very much connected to why we considered using the public dialogue. For AI to be developed and to work for everyone, it needs data access processes that are trusted, and also to ensure that we have the volume and representativeness in the data we collect and use. Another challenge is that AI needs scrutiny because we have limited understanding of the impacts involved and the potential trade-offs that may be needed. For example, there is a tension between maintaining privacy in the data while ensuring that data sets are representative of different groups, and then how this affects the performance of the resulting AI system. So these trade-offs need to be discussed and agreed with everyone involved and impacted by the use of AI. So we are starting from a point where transparency and participation are needed in data access processes. And that's also what we are working towards. So in thinking about how to approach this from a policy development perspective, we decided that since we need transparency and an in-depth involvement and discussions about AI, but then also that we want to get to a place where public participation is the end result, then we should involve the public early on in deciding what that will look like. So we decided, in a sense, to conduct a dialogue about a dialogue, and to use the public dialogue as part of a bottom-up approach to inform how participatory approaches to data access can be explored and designed further, as you can see on the slide. So the public dialogue is the first step in a process of designing a trusted and participatory approach to accessing data. And we're now in the middle phase, where we have launched a new research competition to design data access approaches informed by the public dialogue insights. And then later this year, we will pilot these approaches. We can go to the next slide, please. So what did we learn from conducting this dialogue? I should say that we presented 9 scenarios to the participants of different approaches to making decisions on accessing data. And there was a bit of uncertainty at the beginning of what the outcome of the dialogue should be, in the sense of whether we need to resolve the tensions that might arise when talking about these scenarios, and that participants come to an agreement on a preferred approach. But I'm glad that we decided to go against that. So not only because it would seem as if we were somehow forcing these options to them, but also because we would have missed what for me was the most useful insight from the discussion, which is that a combination of complementary approaches can be used. And given that no single approach was seen as perfect. So we ended up agreeing on principles and themes for designing data access approaches, which is a more, I think for me, it's more important than a resolution to this problem, because that can be used in different contexts. And in fact, it can provide the needed flexibility now that the NHS, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is going through changes in its infrastructures and governance arrangements around data. So working on principles for design, rather finding a final solution, helped us ensure that these insights will remain relevant in a changing context. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the most practical impact of this dialogue is that the insights from it are informing this new research competition that we launched to design approaches to data access systems. So we haven't seen its full impact yet, but we will capture it based on how the follow-up project will be completed. But from a policymaking perspective, the dialogue is important because it adds to the evidence in our aspirations for evidence-based policymaking. The insights of this dialogue help us make the case that we have identified user needs and are using this to design and build services. And of course, this type of evidence provides enhanced assurance of any future decisions on this. Next slide, please. So what the dialogue has reaffirmed to me is the need to consider public participation as an ongoing process or a journey, if you like, in the sense that we are, what you're developing does not stop with just conducting the dialogue. And because of that, perhaps the dialogue doesn't need to provide all the answers. I mean, for us, it is important to continue involving the public, perhaps not always in such an in-depth way, but certainly guided by the existing insights as we explore what needs to be designed and trialed. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. You see, already we're seeing huge variety in the two conversations we've had so far, the two presentations we've had so far. I'm really enjoying some of the questions that I'm seeing appearing, so I can imagine the next stage of later on when we get to that. But before we get there, let me bring in Pete. So Pete, would you like to set out some of your reflections for the group?
Thank you very much, Susanna, and thank you very much to Sciencewise for inviting me to come and speak today. As it says on the slide, I'm Pete Mills, Associate Director at the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. The Nuffield Council was established in 1991 as an independent research and policy institute, and it's probably the foremost bioethics body in the UK. We're funded by the Nuffield Foundation, whose name we bear, and also by the Wellcome Trust and the Medical Research Council. The dialogue that I'm wanting to speak to you about, that we carried out in the middle of last year, is about the use of a new technique of genetic modification that I'm going to call genome editing, that goes under a number of different rubrics. And genome editing is something that has been subject to legislation that was introduced into Parliament in the middle of last year, and in fact will be receiving royal assent tomorrow, I believe. So can I move on to the next slide, please? So why did we consider dialogue? Well, this goes back, I guess, to the beginning of the Council's own inquiry into genome editing and farmed animals. And we were very aware that the history of public debate shows that public views on biotechnologies would be extremely important. But we also found through a literature review that there was a real sort of lack of understanding of what lay behind the views that were expressed by people in the population or sections of the population. And furthermore, those views had been studied only through effectively quantitative surveys largely, and related to first generation biotechnologies rather than the allegedly more precise techniques that were now becoming available. So we wanted to look at whether the change in the technique, whether the passage of time made any difference to people's views, but particularly whether or not there were distinctive issues, because we felt there were, in applying these techniques to animals. Now, the government, as soon as we disengaged from the European Union at the beginning of 2021, started a consultation on carving out a space for regulation of genome editing technologies in agriculture, principally. And it launched a consultation that really focused very much on the preoccupations of the EU regulations themselves, and on those things that fell into the competence of the EU, in other words, on risk. And we felt that there were more issues than were captured by those initial consultations. So we wanted to explore whether people, rather than focusing on consumer protection and focusing on maintaining freedom of choice within a marketplace, felt that there were issues of possibly sort of deeper ethical relevance that were raised by these techniques. In particular, issues about the lives of animals and the impact of new technologies on where the food and farming system as a whole was heading. And the quotation on the left of my slide there, I think really bears out what happens when you treat people principally as consumers. You get this kind of sense that people focus really on what's in front of them, and they know there are things behind it, but they choose to leave it alone because they're not being they're not having to confront those questions. Can I have the next slide, please? So what did we learn? We had 80 participants in our public dialogue over several groups. And in all of those discussions, I think two really salient principles emerged, and they were broadly principles that were embraced by two sort of coalescing groups of participants. The first was a group who were really primarily concerned with reducing the negative impacts of biotechnologies on animals and on the environment. And the second group were perhaps more concerned with the securing benefits for consumers from a food system, and a worry about the fact that introducing biotechnologies might lead to benefits, but perhaps only benefits for producers. So this was very much more about people getting fair access to products, or at least those who wanted to consume animal products. Now, I mean, it seems very much that those principles were to a certain extent in tension, but it's clear on reflection, and this is a point that I think participants arrived at, that neither requires an outright rejection of biotechnologies, nor does it require an overall increase in the consumption of animal products. Or to put it another way, both of them are in fact compatible with biotechnology innovation, and an overall reduction in meat consumption has been recommended broadly by food strategies and other advice. But it was clear that circumstances could lead to a very different kind of outcome. And what the dialogue revealed, I think, was that people recognized that innovation in biotechnologies really needed steering by a responsible system of governance in order to avoid, in effect, producing ever more wretched animals, ever increasing consumption of animal products and benefits that in effect only serve private interests rather than public interests. So this is really the consequence of treating people as citizen and legislators rather than as individual consumers. Could I have the next slide, please? What's the impact of the dialogue been? Well, I'm tempted to quote Jean Lyon on the French Revolution. It's too early to say. I think this is a general principle about public dialogue, is that it reaches a long way into the future. But certainly things that we noticed initially is that for the participants, it certainly roused them from what they themselves described as their willful ignorance. Something that about the circumstances in which their food originated, particularly the treatment of animals that were involved in it. And that caused us some concern, really, because it obviously what we were doing is introducing a kind of cognitive conflict, which became a bit of an ethical issue to us. I mean, were we, for example, overwriting what you might think of as their right to ignorance, if you like, of those things as consumers? So that was one thing. Another thing is it certainly generated significant interest from policymakers. We spoke to the minister who introduced the genetic technology precision breeding bill to Parliament, who was very, very keen to hear the outcome. And indeed, the findings of the dialogue were cited in parliamentary debates around that bill. But I think the effect more generally was that it broadened the debate around biotechnologies from one that was really about consumer interests and about the risk, such as it might be from introducing new technologies, to one that was much more about the food system and the distribution of benefits from innovation. In other words, it sort of shifted the questions that people were asking. And on a more direct level, thinking about that kind of longitudinal governance of innovation systems, it certainly has now been taken up by our commissioning partners, the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, into their discussions about research funding policy through their strategic advisory panels. Could I have the last slide, please? So I was asked to share our top tip, and I think in a variety of different ways, our top tip would be about timing. It's about understanding the characteristic speeds and slownesses of public dialogue. We started looking for partners at the Nuffield Council to run this public dialogue back in 2019 when we started our own project, and it took us a while to get it together with the BBSRC in mid-2020. So there was a long lead in, but things really got moving when we got Sciencewise involved, and I can only say that, you know, getting Sciencewise involved early and getting their help to shape the project was really important to us. Convening an oversight group took a certain amount of time, so that was something that we needed to do early, but we found that the contractors that we engaged, Basis Social, moved extremely quickly, sometimes actually too quickly, and we kind of wanted them to slow down to give us an opportunity to catch up with what they were doing. And I mean, the other thing about timing, I think, is that early engagement with policymakers and maintaining that throughout has been kind of indispensable. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion and trying to answer some of your questions. Thank you very much.
Hugely thank you, Pete. So I am sure, like many of you, I'm trying to follow the questions, which are now getting quite lively. I think we have a sort of variety of different questions. Some I would say are about actually the kind of the process. So how to do this really well? How do we get the right voices, the right engagement, the right groups involved, and getting a particularly underrepresented group? So I'd quite like to make sure we spend a bit of time hearing a little bit about some of the experience, probably from Sciencewise colleagues, to try and make sure we brought that to the fore. Then there's a cluster of questions that start to ask them almost much more challenging, which is brilliant. Some about, you know, has this really had any impact? In particularly when the emphasis here is almost the stopping. Is stopping testimony that's had impact, or are there other ways of showing the real impact? And quite a few of our speakers talked about early signs, but more to come. So I'd like to get into that. But I just wonder before then, let's do that cluster of questions around the process, Susanna. And I think that would be really helpful to those of you, particularly those of you newer into this, to really talk about how those approaches, what we've learned, what we think it works well, and draw on all of those 70 different case studies we've got of experience and share some of that with our participants.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Emma. There's quite a lot in there, and there's not a sort of one answer applies to all. And I know that each of the different projects here will have gone through what specifically they wanted to recruit and reflect in their public participants. I think in terms of, I think there was a question about how do we source public participants, and I think one of the first things that is a common misconception is that they're not self-selecting participants. So it is a recruitment agency that will go out on street, quite possibly, obviously in the pandemic, that was slightly different, to find participants who are willing to spend the time to devote to the dialogue. But sort of before that, there will have been with the commissioners and with the contractors, a thinking through of who do we want to bring here. So the starting point is usually a kind of reflective public, you know, that reflects the demographics of male, female, and life stage and education, maybe things like that. But then quite often there's a drilling down and thinking about the project and saying, are there other groups that we need to raise up here? Are there, for example, in quite a few of the dialogues over the last 18 months, we've boosted certain demographics as well. So whether that be kind of minority ethnic groups or other particular characteristics that we think are underrepresented usually in that reflective group. And then also some dialogues might say, actually, we need a specific stream. I mentioned in my intro about specialist groups. So thinking of some dialogues where there has been a kind of consideration that maybe we need to hear from very much younger people or very much older people, or people who maybe are parents of children with disabilities. So it's thinking through all of those aspects as well. I think that there was a suggestion in the chat about what's the best model and citizens' assemblies, which kind of public dialogue is within this family of different ways in which you can engage publics in dialogue, but the public dialogue that Sciencewise supports so far hasn't included a citizens' assembly. That doesn't mean it couldn't in the future, but obviously citizens' assemblies tend to recruit through a sortition, sort of postal lottery approach, and that, as I say, it tends to be more a kind of on-street recruitment. How many people are involved? Another question that came up. Again, it varies. Somewhere between 40 and a kind of 150. Some dialogues have gone further than that, but I'd say that the minimum is around 40 for that. I think I've picked up most of the points, but Emma will tell me if I haven't.
Yeah, better. Sorry, I'm struggling to get off mute. I'm not sure I'll be able to keep there's a lot happening in the chat, which is fantastic, or in the Q&A section, which is brilliant. So I wonder if I could bring in some of the our other panel members. There was a question about how do you work out which policy makers you want to engage with, and also actually there was also a question, I think, about that linking through also to the decision makers in policy as well. So that link through to politicians. Any reflections from your experience about that angle? And I think that also tracks this question about really influencing the outcomes and decisions that are made as a result. So Pete, could I bring you back in first?
Yes, certainly. So I think, I mean, in many ways we were fortunate because at the Nuffield Council we'd already been running our own inquiry for a while, and in the very early stages of that, one of the key things that we wanted to do was engage with the relevant policymakers. In this case, it was officials and scientific advisors in DEFRA principally. So we'd have that, you know, kind of long series of discussions, and also with research funders that we were able to kind of then bring into the dialogue. I mean, I think the other thing is, you know, ministers come and go, but officials tend to remain, or at least posts tend to remain a little bit longer. I'm looking suddenly at Nina and realizing that her department has just been reconfigured, but there is a kind of, I mean, we were fortunate that there has been a continuity in the kind of ownership of these policy areas that makes life easy. So you know, early engagement through those channels. And the other part of it, I think, was helped by the oversight group that we had. Now, all Sciencewise projects I know have an oversight group of diverse composition of varying sizes. We had about 15 people, which I think is probably quite large, but given the range of different interests that we were pressing on, I think it was extremely important that we had all of those accounted for, and they were extremely helpful because they were people who in their own fields were extremely eminent and authoritative, and could sort of feed into the research space and into industry and into other areas, and by those rather more circuitous routes obviously feed back into the policy process through their own networks, and also playing I guess into the public space as well, into you know, into the public consciousness and those discussions that go on around dinner tables, and eventually kind of feed back into you know, what people hear about. Could
I keep you going a little bit longer, Pete? Because we just had a question in from Alice asking about what the key differences are between public dialogue and actually just a focus group with the public. So again, your reflections on that, because it continues this answer, I think, a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not an absolute expert on this, but I mean, it seems to me that a focus group is established to answer a particular kind of question, and public dialogue tends to be a little bit more open. I mean, we had, coming into this, a hypothesis that was sort of generated through our own work about, well, it was more wanting to explore a counterpoint to the way in which the debate, as we saw it, had been going, which was to focus very much on, you know, people as atomized consumers, or as individuals, and enable people to both frame and address a problem that they recognized as one that they had to face in common, actually, and that was the key thing. So it was really, I think the difference is probably a bit more around the reflective orientation of the dialogue, about the opportunity to engage with a variety of experts and people who can feed into it, and also really about the ability to just kind of explore a range of other questions, a range of find your own way through the problematic, as it were.
Thank you, Pete. George, I'm there are some questions I think about a particular emphasis which Susanna picked up about how do we make sure we're really reaching into underrepresented groups, really listening to voices, some of the quieter voices, and I think the theme of some of your presentation was the exploration of trust, and therefore any reflections then with that particular angle from your experience of the value and what you learned from that particular aspect of your work.
So just in relation to the question as well around who we engaged and also what we wanted to achieve with that. We made sure that we had a broadly representative sample of individuals from different locations, different ethnicities, age, and gender, but we also wanted to make sure that there was a healthy mix of different attitudes towards data. So when we recruited, we used these categories of data absolutists, data pragmatists, and those who were unconcerned, to make sure that we would have different views and attitudes around coming in around those levels of concern and trust in how data is used. And I think that allowed for a more richer discussion, and perhaps that goes into your previous question about the value of the public dialogue. My experiences with focus groups is that they do tend to be limited in terms of their scope and their time. But what the public dialogue does, it just allows time for participants first to get their head around the issues, hear from the experts, and then start voicing their different views, debating about these views, talking about potential trade-offs around some of these questions that are being brought forward to them. So yeah, I kind of feel that a public dialogue in the format that is being delivered very much aligns with efforts in sort of building trust towards something, because it brings those different voices, and there's a debate, and there is in the end the outcome that all of these have been listened.
Thank you, George. I'm wondering, Nina, have you got any reflections both about that, the sort of opening question around how do we kind of influence, how do you get the right policy makers cluster? But there's actually a particular question that's come up a couple of times about vested interests as well, and how we make sure that we are both acknowledging some of those and whether we use that language of vested interests, but also how to explore that and bring that really healthily into the dialogue.
Yes, I think in terms of vested interests, we're in a very good position in government in that we're independent, and our role is through the government chief scientific advisors to provide that science advice. So when it comes to kind of navigating I suppose you could call it the politics of it, but disclosing those vested interests, we don't really have to do that because we already sit on a slightly separate seat to other people in government. In terms of finding policy, I was interested in kind of how we find policymakers to engage with. I guess also luckily we don't have to try too hard because our science advice is already taken quite it's kind of already being drawn on throughout obviously COVID increased the visibility of that. But I think considering that our department has just been completely reconfigured, you'd be surprised at how the teams stay the same. They're still the same people to talk to. They might have a different, a different Secretary of State or a different permanent secretary, but they're still interested and they still have an interest. Not to mention also our foresight reports don't always get, their primary purpose is not always to be used by departments, by government departments mainly, but also local authorities, any kind of groups that want to use our scenarios as kind of stress testing of their policies. So to see if we were to go down this route to reach net zero in a specific council, how does that play out across the four different scenarios, and what do we need to consider in order to do that, and is public dialogue part of that? We obviously now have the blueprint for how to do that with our scenarios, and so that can help encourage other groups, government and outside of government, to do that, which is also why we publish all of our reports externally as well.
Thank you. Suzanne, I wonder if I could bring you back in, because I think there's still been a few more practical questions like about size of groups, things, which I get the sense people are just trying to get their heads around what this actually entails. So again, another opportunity to give people a little bit more practical support, so they know if they reach out to you what they would get. And then I think also some sort of further questions then continuing to be about actually how do we, do we promise people that actually as a result of participating in this, something will happen? And it's, again, trust is a theme that's come up both in the context of some of the research questions we're exploring, but actually that sort of sense that this is this just a one-off thing? Is it a token thing? That sort of thing. So anything around that I think would be really valuable for people to hear.
Great, thanks, Emma. In terms of the size of groups, usually, I said at the beginning that they're facilitated groups, and in order to encourage discussion and in order to, I think there was a question as well about how do you hear from voices who are quieter. So whilst you might have the whole dialogue might be engaging with 40, 100 people, when they're in their discussions and the deliberations, that's broken down into groups of probably about 7, and each of those groups will have a facilitator. So, and that's about creating an environment where everybody feels like, oh, is this the right thing to say? So it's about equalizing people's voice, enabling people to have that ability to say what it is that they think about that and hear from each other. And there'll be other parts of the process where they're all together as a group, maybe in hearing from a specialist or reporting back on something. So that's a bit of a sense of how that facilitated process and the size of group happens. In terms of the promise to the people, again, I mentioned at the beginning that every Sciencewise dialogue, one of the early things we do with commissioners is we say, what is this going to inform? What's this going to change? And that's why I think it's different from a focus group as well. You can do a focus group, you can just extract information from people and you can do something with it, or you can choose not to. Whereas we say, no, we want to see that if you're going to engage with the public, it's going to have an impact. And that's quite hard to determine sometimes, but it's what's that route? What's this going to inform? What policy might this go forward to? What strategy might this reflect on? So that's the early start of what that promise is. We always, the contractors will be sending the report back to participants, so they at least know that their voice has been heard. I think as well what we've seen, and there was a point about evaluation in the chat as well. So all of the dialogues have evaluations that run alongside, and that evaluation will also ask participants about their experiences. So that forms part of the evaluation report. And I can think back to some of the dialogues. I think we've had a couple of dialogues where the newborn screening dialogue that was held a couple of years ago, we then, the contractor then went back and said, do you know what, there's this particular nuance, this particular nuance bit about of screening that we'd like to further delve into. Are other people up for engaging with that? And I think the contractor sort of expected that a few people would come back to that, and they had a huge amount of uptake because people really value the opportunity to have their voice heard. In terms of actual kind of impact, that's why we try to, after the dialogue has finished, the evaluators will go back 6 months later and say, what difference has this made? And sometimes I think, as some of the speakers have said, some of that impact happens a lot further down the track. And we try and kind of keep people engaged with that. Data protection sometimes stops stops things like that. And the other aspect, again, there was a question there. I think there are a few examples of where things have been stopped by the public dialogue, and it's more, I'm struggling to remember the project. I think it was around a wellbeing program, where the public said, you know what, this is not the right way to engage with us. And so a sort of multi-million-pound program was scrapped and redirected. I think more positively, where we see the impact is that people go, you know, we heard that that was a priority, and now we're going to amplify that in the work that we do, or we're going to set a particular stream of work planning on that, so that, yeah, it's rather than stopping, it's changing the prioritization, changing the direction of what happens. I hope that's okay.
That's really helpful. I'm learning all the time, and I that treasure troves of all the different experiences you've had is just amazing. So to keep drawing on that, and I would encourage all of you, when you're thinking, you know, thinking about this, what might you commission? How might it be relevant to your world? It's you know, that's the expertise. There's so much learning from Sciencewise. They can help you with some of that as well. So if you're interested at all, reach out and ask some questions, and then you'll see what some of the questions are you could then be asking and exploring for yourself. We've come back again at the end towards vested interest. There seems to be a sense we need to go a bit further again on this, and I'm quite interested in this because I'm trying to work out where the different angles are on vested interest. I'm sort of thinking that one of the themes that came through, I think, in Nina's presentation when she was talking about the futures, is that, again, getting the public dialogue going around actually envisaging the future and thinking about those scenarios. That in itself is a great, maybe the level is the wrong word, but, you know, actually quite often these very powerful sort of be they corporates, be they different kind of ways of thinking, whatever, some of these more powerful entrenched interests often frame the questions that we're actually asking in policy. And actually, that's why I personally think some of the value is to ask ourselves earlier on how to broaden that dialogue out, because then you make sure that you aren't then finding that the agenda is set by what, and I think I'm trying to work out where the invested interest is. It's quite a laden term, but, you know, that sort of sense of where the power is, where the dynamics are, what the kind of what are the prevailing kind of interests, and therefore how that's framing. So I think just continue to think through and challenge ourselves constantly on where could there be value in public dialogue is the counterpoint. And for all of you involved or thinking about commissioning, that is exactly the space where then we start to rebalance out that sense of there being kind of a powerful few or vested interest in things that are getting more influence than perhaps this process would show that they need, deserve, or get the right outcomes. But I don't know if any panelists have got any further reflections on that to broaden that out, because it's come back a couple of times in the conversation. George?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding it in the same way that you are, I totally agree with you, Emma. This is a public dialogue is a way to address some of the limitations in making decisions around how services and are designed and or provided, but also how investment is being assigned on different infrastructures. So for us, doing the public dialogue from the start and saying that whatever is going to be designed and brought in later on will need to align with these insights is a way to not only minimize those vested interests, but also to make sure that they are driven as well by the insights from the dialogue.
Thank you, George. Pete.
Well, I was just going to recount a little example that we had in our dialogue about the difficulty of managing the interests that surround particularly biotechnologies and continue to do so. I mean, I think that probably the first thing to say is you're not going to get a dialogue that is impartial, and you're not going to manage to balance the interests in some way of all the different inputs and all the different influences on it. So really, probably the thing that you need to focus on then is accounting for where the different inputs are coming from, and being a little bit critical, learning to be critical about what's coming. So we said, when we initially convened the oversight group for our dialogue, we'd actually taken the view in the commissioning group that we probably wouldn't want to have industry representation on that, because we felt that those who were involved in research were represented through university researchers who also had interests in livestock breeding industry, for example. But there was a concern about involving strong industry voices on the oversight group, that it would pull it too far in one direction. But the group itself, when we initially convened them, felt that it wasn't sufficiently rounded without those interests represented. So we brought somebody in from one of the breeding organisations to represent that industry voice around the table. But that didn't mean that we didn't get into some really difficult and almost kind of, not, I was going to say confrontational, but difficult to reconcile discussions about the kinds of inputs that were going, the kind of stimulus materials, for example, that were being offered to participants, which meant those materials themselves became, you know, almost impossible to agree on, because the, you know, different kinds of evidence that were tending to demonstrate different things, which appeared to be about the same thing, were actually turned out to be incommensurable, and potentially everybody wanted to claim that they were being, you know, misled in some way by whatever evidence was put forward. Anyway, the members of the oversight group worked very hard for us and were participated in a lot of the discussions amongst the participants. And as they kind of moved through these discussions, what we found was that the participants became incredibly adept at kind of critiquing what they were being told by participants from different, with different backgrounds or with different interests. To the extent that we stopped worrying, actually, because they were effectively using all the information that they gathered from different places, and you know, they became very good at sort of sniffing out when they were being cajoled in one way or another.
And Nina, do you want to come in as well?
Yes, I have a really quick reflection that I completely second. I don't usually use Zoom. I'll put my hand down. There you go. I completely second what you said about challenging ourselves when we talk about vested interests, and thinking about the positionalities of all of that is really interesting, because I don't necessarily think about it as vested interests. The way that I framed it that might be useful for others too, if they're trying to persuade policymakers or other groups that might not traditionally use public dialogues, is you're trying to challenge them in a healthy way, to challenge them to say, let's use some robust social scientific methods to explore the policy more, rather than we want to, you know, we don't want to obstruct, we don't want to do any of that, but it's just having that really strong evidence-based view, and the evidence is coming from people, which might not always happen, to add nuance and kind of add a more rounded nature to the policy that people are considering. And that has been quite effective in kind of persuading people why that's useful. Yeah, just my reflection.
Thank you, Nina. I'm really enjoying that I'm seeing in the Q&A. I see some people just congratulating Sciencewise on the impact they've managed to have and the momentum that's been built. So huge thanks for calling that out. Also, some of you are beginning to show some examples of what you've been up to in different parts of the UK. In Wales, I think there's been some great participatory futures projects work there. So really good to see some of that cross-fertilization, so that, again, this broader community can stay connected and support each other, hopefully with a bit more renewed enthusiasm for how we can make some progress here. So this is fantastic. I'm wondering if I might take the opportunity to ask a couple of my own questions for the panel members. A question I always like to ask folk, but I think really pertinent for you, is what surprised you most? Because I think this is the thing, quite often I'm told by people, well, we know what we'll find if we go and ask the public. And this is my point about humility, is actually we really don't. And that's the point. So I'd be really interested, both perhaps about the process, but maybe actually about just some of the really nuggets that actually really help challenge your perspectives as well as those part of the group as well. So yeah, what surprised you most? Let's start with Nina.
Oh, what surprised me most? It's tricky. A lot of things surprised me. I think I won't talk, not just specifically in the dialogue that happened, but what did surprise me was that when we had these findings and when we'd seen the analyses and what was coming out of it, was I'm not sure if it was a surprise. I think it would have been a surprise to others. I obviously knew this would have happened, but the nuance with which people were willing to discuss these things, it wasn't just that's not going to work, that's silly. It was, which I think what I spoke about before about how policymakers might have less nuanced views on, or see the public as one mass of the public, is actually they have really, as we know, this is really obvious to all of us on the call, that they have really nuanced views, and it will always depend on their life experiences, and they're willing to engage and willing to change their minds potentially based on the discussions that they have. Which, yeah, maybe I've dodged it a bit, that didn't surprise me, but I'm glad that it surprised others.
Thank you. George, anything from you?
So I would probably flip that question in the sense that I actually don't feel that it's important for me to be surprised, or even to kind of what is it that I need to get out of this. I think what's important is to conduct this and listen to what the public has to say. Some of it, yes, may have been things that we may have known, but that does not take away from the value of it being voiced and allowing that to happen. There's nothing worse than just continuing and doing work through assumptions and just maybe deciding that, oh, I may not need to do something because I already know what it is. I think it's important to listen and confirm that. So in that sense, but just to maybe reiterate some of the things that Nina said, just the depth in the debates, and because our dialogue was about trade-offs, just the complexity and depth in the discussions, and the trade-offs that individuals are willing to make when they're discussing it as a collective, and then what that would mean in how you design things. I think that's where the most useful insights have come. And to us, there was a lot of discussions around putting more responsibilities on the individuals against putting the responsibilities to the experts. And there was some really interesting discussions there around perhaps the importance of both.
Thank you. Pete, what surprised you?
Well, I suppose one of the things that I've already mentioned was quite how well the participants pushed back against the experts, and it wasn't as though it wasn't because they were coming from a kind of predetermined position. It was really about the way in which they worked together as a group, kind of critically, not to assert a particular position, but to actually kind of get at some kind of enlightenment or understanding through the process. So that was one thing that I think surprised me quite, how supportive they were of each other, given that the groups that we had different were coming in with different perspectives. Because the other thing is, I don't know about surprise, but I'm certainly heartened by the fact that when people were kind of brought in relatively cold to these kind of complex questions, they really got engaged with them, and there was, I presented that quotation earlier about how people recognized that they had been slumbering dogmatically up until the point at which they were engaged in the dialogue, and then suddenly became aware of their own sort of cognitive conflicts, their own kind of duplicity, and got really kind of engaged with those questions. But then there was a kind of arc, I think. So they went from being complacent to being very engaged to concluding, and I hope I'm not overinterpreting this, that actually it wasn't their business to be doing this. It was the business of their government or their public authorities who were responsible for this, for these matters, to be providing a kind of agreed measure of protection or support, or to otherwise express public interest through the policies and procedures and governance measures that they enacted or had in place. And so I think that arc was really kind of interesting to me. So yeah.
So I'm hoping we might well have enthused with the experience you've shared quite a few of our listeners, our participants, on some of the value here. I wonder if you might also, as a panel, share what did it take to get this off the ground? I imagine there are skeptics or people just don't see the value, whatever. And I don't know at what point you became converted personally and this became something you wanted to drive, but anything about that early stage of kind of getting this thing going, and the tips then for those people still with us. Let's do it in a different, let's start with Pete, let's go backwards.
Okay, thanks. Well, I said, I think that I recognised, having looked back over the history of engagement and public debates around genetic modification, that this would be an important thing for us to do, and it would be important for us to do it via a dialogue rather than simply a kind of survey or just some sort of quantitative analysis of public attitudes. So we started a long way back, and it took it took a really long time to get it together. And we talked to a lot of people, and we were just really fortunate that our interests and those of the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council aligned around this, and that we were able to put something together, because I think we both had that kind of intuition that there was missing, insofar as these questions are about making policy based on evidence, there was missing evidence here. And it was evidence of the sort that's about, what lies behind people's views, what happens when people recognize that this is not just something that they face individually and are powerless in the face of, but something that is really about everybody's future, and that the food and farming system is something that they all want to have a stake in. So that's what got us moving, that's what got us enthused, and it was just kind of finding other people who had an interest in that, that missing piece of the debate, really, to join up.
Thank you. George, have you any reflections on that?
I guess for us, it did help that we set ourselves up as a research program, and also that my initiative is about ethical considerations, because then it's kind of like at the core of what we're trying to achieve. And being a research program, it did allow us longer timelines for delivering our outputs. We have an overall sort of like 3-year timeline that maybe takes away a little bit of that pressure, the time pressure. And I mean, I understand that that's not always possible, but there is perhaps something there about how we design and set expectations around our programs and the kind of like values that we bring forward. And perhaps as well, just to state the obvious, making a strong case from the beginning of why the dialogue is needed, and Sciencewise can help a lot with that. In the sense of highlighting the importance of establishing trust and transparency in what needs to be delivered.
Thank you. And Nina?
I think for us, it was a bit of a non-starter that we would have to do this public dialogue, because it, as I said, the whole project is about society, and you can't purely quantify society with kind of an energy systems model. And while that part of the project was extremely useful in setting out what the scenarios would look like and seeing if they could actually reach net zero, for example, with the parameters that we've given it, that we knew that the qualitative aspect would be really important. I think perhaps the project did it slightly the wrong way around. If I were to kind of go to the beginning and do it again, in terms of we created the narratives and the quantitative modelling first, and then asked the public what they thought of it, which was valuable, but you know, there were some parts of the narratives that then came out in the public dialogues actually that was framed slightly wrong, slightly out of kilter with what it would be like for someone with a different experience, someone living in central London, for example. And I think, twisting question aside, to say if we were to again, I think we would value that input from the very beginning more. So using the public to create the narratives with us, rather than using them as you know, a sounding board to see what they thought about them. I think that'll probably come through in the report that could have, if it had been flipped, it might have created it, but it might have made it a lot more difficult to model it. I guess we'll never know, but a good thought experiment.
That's very helpful, Nina, because actually I'm going to give you all the opportunity just before we finish to give us the one top tip or one reflection, something you really wish you'd known before you embarked on this. But I'm going to give you a moment to think about it, and bring Susanna back in, because there's been a number of other questions that have come up. I don't know, you won't be able to answer all of them. And I think our general theme is, if you have any questions or an interest in this, get in touch with Sciencewise. But Susanna, are there a couple of final thoughts from you before I give our panelists the final say?
I thought you were going to ask me there, Emma, about I think there were some questions about what good looks like.
Yes, what good looks like, exactly. And so whether you want to come back on that.
I'm going to skirt around that a little bit. I mentioned the Sciencewise guiding principles, and behind that is a quality framework, which is worth dipping into, because it's our sort of starting point for that. In terms of what we think is good. And of course that evolves. So come the pandemic, we had to evolve, and all the contractors had to evolve in terms of what's good practice in doing this. Previously it was all face-to-face. How do we create that same environment in an online space? So of course it evolves, and I know that there will be other practitioners out there with you know, working on this and evolving with that as well. I think there was a question about are participants involved in the design of the process? Honestly, I would say probably less opportunity than there might be in other sorts of processes. And quite often that is because there's often a time challenge in government commissioned processes. That said, we always try to enable the space, or encourage contractors to enable the space that, you know, if these are multiple sessions, after the first or throughout, participants might say, okay, we've heard about that, but what we really need to hear about is somebody from business or somebody from an NGO on this, so that they can determine what the sort of evidence and information is that they need as well. So, and then I think there was a point about involvement in the governance as well. Again, less so, though a good few dialogues have had where commissioners have had existing sort of advisory groups that have had particular publics involved. I'm thinking again, One Screening had their they had an ongoing group that they could bring them into the oversight group, so that it was a different perspective than, say, some of the specialists who are sort of professional specialists, I suppose, who do it as a day job. I think I'm going to leave it there, but sort of say time. So nothing is impossible. Everything is bespoke when it's designed as a dialogue, but time and scope and funding are quite often the parameters within which we juggle. Thanks, Em.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm now going to ask colleagues to make sure, firstly, that the chat is now reopened, because we're getting to that very final stage. So for all of you who are still participating, please use the chat function for a bit of final networking or any further points that you want to make. I'll now turn to the panel and give you the opportunity for your final one departing thought for the group. George, I don't think you've gone first in my latest round, so I'll turn to you next.
Yeah, no problem. I think I'm going to steal one of Pete's point, which was around if there are ways to honor the timelines on this and try not to rush the dialogue. I would say that's quite important. Especially, I think for us, it would have been good perhaps to spend a little bit more time in developing the materials for the dialogue, maybe exploring different ways of that material, understanding that there are time pressures around this, but if there are ways to you know, extend and honor the timelines, that would be ideal.
Fantastic, thank you. Nina.
Mine is also funny on the timelines because our timelines are very tight, and so I would recommend on following George on that if at all possible. Unfortunately, we were on very strict timelines, as government usually is. My top tip is to go into the process being ready to hear things and be challenged for things that you hadn't necessarily thought about, because the public is going to give you perspectives and challenge you, and the kind of policy or whatever program you're talking about in ways that you might not have considered, and just be open to that, and just write it all down, I suppose.
Thank you. I like the idea of writing them down. I see we're also seeing comments about just continue to keep answering questions when we can. We'll keep trying to make sure that we're giving as much as a response to all of you, because also you've asked us different questions than we anticipated, showing exactly the value of dialogue and listening. Pete, final reflection from you.
Well, I suppose one thing I don't know quite how we solve or address this, but I mean, we always talk about, you know, giving an account to the participants of the value of what they've done. We held a launch event for the findings of the dialogue that we commissioned, and we involved 3 of the participants in that process. But talking to them afterwards, obviously they had, you know, there was a great deal of enthusiasm to sort of continue to engage with that. But obviously that's not something that, you know, that stretches beyond the dialogue. But there is, you know, I think the one thing that I really like about Sciencewise, but which is also a limitation, is the evaluation goes on for 6 months beyond the end of the process, and the evaluation has been extremely helpful. But actually, you know, to think about this properly, you need to go on way beyond that, you know, and trace through the way in which, you know, the dialogues has kind of inflected the public discussion, and not individually as standalone things, but just as kind of part of the, you know, the general conversation, the noise, and that's really hard to do, but it would be really interesting to kind of think through more.
Thank you. So in the final couple of moments we have, what I want to do now is turn the spotlight onto all of our participants. And I want to challenge all of you to just pause for a few moments and make sure you have absorbed what you've heard, but actually really ask yourself, is there, you know, well, where can public voice be really valuable to your area of policy or research? You know, where is it going to build in that incredibly deep and rich insight and that diversity of perspectives and views that we've talked about throughout the session? And where is it going to improve the robustness of your work? So just make sure you're really actively thinking about that. And therefore also the other question is, you know, is imagine the consequences of not doing that. You know, really try and work that one through, and then help that see, you know, is there an opportunity here? And then in really practical terms, I hope that you've enjoyed hearing Suzanne as much as I have. You know, Sciencewise are a great team. Really encourage all of you to reach out just with any questions you've got, because they'll be able to help, they'll be able to guide you, they'll be able to help broaden those questions out, explore them in different ways, and support you in getting something off the ground if that's where you want to go. So then before the very final moments, I just then want to thank my amazing panel. Thank you so much for contending with some very wide-ranging questions. We went in lots of different perspectives. I really hope you've enjoyed talking to each other and hearing and learning from each other. And I hugely thank you all for your enthusiasm and your professionalism. So, and for giving up the time for this afternoon. So thank you ever so much. Then the final practicalities, I hope people have had the chance to fill in the evaluation form or can keep doing it so we can learn from this and put on something that people find valuable in the future. And also, I think some of you keep asking, the video will be shared with people. So we've got that link, will be sent around to everyone. So do share with your colleagues as well. So I really, and then finally, just thank the team who are behind the scenes, have orchestrated this, put it together and developed the programme. So huge thank you to everybody. And then finally, to all of our participants for brilliant questions, for engaging well, and for being such fantastic active listeners and actually participants themselves. So thank you ever so much. With that, have a great afternoon, everybody. See you all.